Welcome, Conversing listeners. What is the credibility of the faith in a time like this? The Rethinking Church Initiative is launching a new podcast called Credible Witness.
I'm Nikki Toyamasito, and this is Credible Witness, a collection of stories and wisdom from faithful people wrestling with and bearing witness to the credibility of Christian life today. Each episode is an invitation to listen generously and courageously to one person, navigating social tension and moral complexity, negotiating doubts, struggles, and fears, overcoming obstacles and pursuing justice, and living out the convictions of their faith. And every voice reminds us that the church is called to be a credible witness to Christ, a living reality of hope, justice, truth, and love.
It's a beautifully rendered collection of stories that reward a courageous and generous listening. So please check out our show notes for links to the Credible Witness podcast feed, as well as crediblewitness.us. I'm hoping that you'll subscribe today, and I believe you'll be deeply encouraged by the series of episodes to come. Thank you for listening courageously with me, and may God bless this new effort.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comet Magazine and Fuller Seminary. I'm Mark Labberton. Welcome to Conversing. Today we have a very special guest on Conversing. I'm so delighted to be able to welcome Mark Elsdon. Mark is a person that I've known for many decades as a student first at the University of California, Berkeley, and for decades in between then and now, he has served as a pastor, being educated at Princeton Seminary. He's led a ministry in Madison, Wisconsin called Press House, which is a Presbyterian ministry on the edge of the University of Wisconsin campus. He is a person who's gone on in that work to realize that, in fact, one of the most significant assets that every congregation has is property. And yet, one of the great challenges in these days of declining membership and smaller budgets is how to make that sustainable and valuable. He's developed with others a whole approach through the lens of social entrepreneurship and strategic decision-making, how to use property, religious purposed property, for the common good. And he's established organizations and done work that has been featured in places like the New York Times and Chronicle of Philanthropy and Religious News Service and CBS Nightly News, all examples of coverage that's been given to Mark and the work that he and others have been doing. He's a thought leader in subjects specifically related to faith-based impact investing, social enterprise, and property development. He's the editor of Gone for Good, Negotiating the Coming Wave of Church Property Transition, and another book, We Aren't Broke, Uncovering Hidden Resources for Mission and Ministry. You'll see more as you follow the links in the notes, but we're so glad to welcome you, Mark. Thank you so much for being here today. I am eager for this conversation.
It's great to be talking with you. Really glad for the opportunity.
You know, we've known one another for some time, and I've admired and cheered along from the distant sidelines what you've been up to in the 3 decades that we've known one another since you were a college student to what you're doing now. And it's partly that arc that I'd like to start with. Just tell us a little bit about yourself, your own development, and how it came that you are now engaged in the particular work and writing that you're doing, which is going to be the focus of what we're going to talk about.
Yeah. So, it's fun to kind of realize that it has been about 30 years, I think, since we knew each other in Berkeley. And those were very good years, actually, that I remember fondly still. So I met, as you know, I met my now wife, Erica Liu, there. And then we married shortly after and worked at a church in the Bay Area for a couple of years, then went to seminary in New Jersey, out in Princeton, took us all the way across the country. And then we were called to this wild and interesting and dormant campus ministry at the University of Wisconsin-Madison campus. And we had actually never even been to Madison. And when one of our mutual friends called us to say, hey, this is available, this is happening, come check it out, we thought, well, I guess at least at a minimum, it's a free trip to Madison to somewhere we had been. Our daughter was only, 8 weeks old, I think, when we first visited, and she is now a senior in college. So we came to Madison, and we had this incredible opportunity to be a part of relaunching a campus ministry that had an enormously beautiful history, but that had gone to 0 students and 0 activity. And a part of that involved redeveloping its property and putting up about a $17 million student housing facility that's home to about 250 students.
It's amazing.
And that is what got me down this journey and towards thinking about how land and money really align with mission and ministry for fruit in people's lives and in communities. And so that's sort of the start of it. I mean, there's obviously way more to the details of it all than that, but that's sort of the general arc of what led me into the work that I'm doing now. Basically, being a part of building and then living with and managing a residential development project for 20 years that was transformative both for the organization as well as for the lives of thousands and thousands of students that were reached by it. Yep.
I don't think you went to seminary thinking of yourself as a property developer and the manager of a $17 million housing project. So what began to change in you that you could see the necessity and the need, probably? That's always a part of it. But what beyond the need drew you in this direction?
Yeah, I mean, there was, the pressing need at the time for that organization is probably pretty similar to the pressing need that drives a lot of folks today, which is a lack of viable, sustainable funding. I mean, really, to be honest, as well as a building with massive deferred maintenance and a property that had to be dealt with in some way, right? So it couldn't just go on the way it was, right?
Right.
And those are the things that present themselves often as the presenting problem. But really what was clear, and it took years of this work to realize that what was really underneath that was opportunity.
Yes.
For mission and ministry to really flourish. And that was the real driver. I mean, like you said, no, we did not set out to be property developers or managers. And I should say, Erica is still running Press House. I'm no longer there, but she is the director and the pastor there, still running it. So she's still living with it all day to day. And the things never go away, right? And so, but you realize that actually it isn't about property, nor is it about money. It's about people's lives, and it's about God's work in people's lives. That's what it's about, right?
Right.
And so then, the turn is, how do the assets, the financial assets, the real estate assets, the space assets really do that? Become something that is a gift that can be really transformative. And that's the part that's the best.
Right, right. So when that, as you said, years are going by and you're experiencing all that this is requiring, but you're beginning to have the insight that this was really about something much deeper than the project that was in your lap at the moment. What were the factors that were causing that insight? How did you come to see that unfold?
Well, for one, you begin to see the possibility of what can be done when there is sustainable funding.
Right. What a thought.
And when space is used for students flourishing, in this case it was, right? And so that happened both in the historic 100-year-old church building that we were able to renovate as a result of that project, and the space that continued to be. That's more familiar to, I think, those of us in the church. But the other examples were what we were able to do in the residential component and community. So one of my favorite aspects of what happens at Press House still today is the sober housing program that operates there. Small number of students, but massive impact in people's lives. And so this is a program for students in addiction recovery, opioid addiction, alcohol addiction, and others. And these are students that literally would not potentially be alive and certainly not graduating from college were it not for a program like this. And this program has saved the state of Wisconsin more than $1 million in addiction-related costs. There are real it's the good news, right? The gospel, the word gospel, good news. It's the good news in the lives of these students and in the lives of that population in a way that we just couldn't even begin to touch previously. And so we're going kind of much deeper and broader with the ministry as a result of the real estate. Yeah.
Now, just so that we're all clear, this is a program inside a housing project that you developed in which students in recovery in various forms are housed in the same facility, is that right? As the wider population that it houses.
Correct.
And that gives a chance for students to receive the attending services necessary for recovery to happen inside a student housing format. How many places in the country are there where you have drug rehab programs going on inside university housing?
Yeah, probably not many.
Not many.
No.
I honestly, just sitting here, I'm racking my brain to think if I've ever really heard of exactly this. There probably is something like this or adjacent to the campus perhaps, and I know this is adjacent to the campus, but the fact that it's in actual student housing is a remarkable thing. I love, to me, it's just such a fun and wonderful gift of grace to think about you and Erica as undergraduates, and then this trajectory that was following the will of God in your lives, first for ministry, then for theological education, then for all the dynamics of what pastoral support and life and ministry in a place called Presbyterian House, Press House in Madison was going to do. And then it unfolds into this extraordinary vision. And frankly, that would be enough. But what has also then continued to happen is that lived experience mushrooms, it would seem to me now, into something much larger, which is really how that model, those experiences that you've had, et cetera, really reshaped how you began to think about churches who hold property and assets, which they may or may not really even be particularly conscious of, not be able to understand its value, not see its potential. But the work that you've done has brought all of that forward. So talk about how that begins to unfold. So you've done this remarkable thing that's happening at Press House in Madison, but then you start reflecting on that. You've written 2 books on this, and you've become a consultant that works with churches and organizations around this. So talk to us about that. How did that wider vision and ministry unfold?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that was fun was discovering I actually enjoyed this intersection of money and mission. And it's not something that everyone does, and that's fine, right? We all are called in different ways and have different gifts, but I actually did enjoy it, and I found real life and possibility in that intersection point. So I went back and did an MBA at the University of Wisconsin many years after doing my MDiv. So sort of maybe reverse of what a lot of people do actually, right? And I found that helpful because it grounded me in the language of business as I had been grounded in the language of theology previously. Not because I think business is anything particularly special, but because it can be a tool. It can be a useful tool, right? And so I started to become aware of what this sort of move can do again in really the transforming lives and transforming communities. And I think we're in a place in American Christianity right now. Well, we're certainly in a place of major transition and of major upheaval almost, really, on many levels. Not just about our money and our property, but we'll stick to that today, I think. But on many levels, right, we're in a bit of upheaval there. But we're in a major change in the way people are engaging their faith, I think. And so I think sometimes I talk about this as like the Blockbuster video moment, where Blockbuster video in 2000 suddenly people stopped going to changed the way they watch movies. They stopped going to rent a DVD or a VHS or whatever and then returning it on a Monday morning after the weekend, right? We got them sent in the mail via Netflix and then streaming and so on. People still watch movies though. They still want that experience of something that transcends kind of the moment they're in, right? But they don't do it the way they used to. And so all the spaces, all the stores, the Blockbuster video stores immediately become, well, what are they for, right? The way people are engaging is so I believe that I don't think God's going away. I don't think God's declining. I never have believed that. Maybe it makes me very Presbyterian, but but the way people are engaging their faith is really changed and is changing. And I think any There's just no way sort of around that reality. And it's sort of that Blockbuster video moment in the way people, they still want to engage in things that matter. They still want experiences, I believe, of the divine. They still want to be a part of things that matter. They still want to be a part of community that's meaningful and real. They want to be a part of transformative, purposeful living. All of that's still true. They're just not wanting to access it primarily on a Sunday morning in a worship service and in a Sunday school class afterwards, kind of a thing, right? Which was the model, the vast majority of the model of the American Christian church for a long time.
Right.
So we're in this transformative moment. Well, then what does that mean? And at the same time, we're facing all these really serious, complex problems as a nation and as a society, recognizing racism, recognizing climate change, recognizing like serious things that we want to respond to as people of faith. And we're running out of money. And our buildings are older and getting older, aging. And so at the very moment that the way people are engaging and where the money is coming from, at the very same time as our buildings need the most work because they're all sort of reaching this point of needing lots of renovation and repair, all of these things are colliding at the same time.
Right.
And I think that's when I started to think, oh man, there's something here to really explore. And as I said earlier, it sort of presents as a problem of money and space, but it really is fundamentally about people's lives and about the way the money and space intersects there.
Right, right.
Yeah.
So as that was unfolding, you began to write and reflect on what you had learned in the first experience that you'd had. But that, I think, probably emerged also out of a growing testing of the waters around churches in particular that have property, but may not really understand its actual full value and potential flexibility and availability for a fresh way of thinking about their property and resources, which then puts them back in the intersection that you were discovering yourself and trying to help churches. So talk to us about that experience as you began to, churches probably were paying attention to what you were doing. They were seeing the way you had seen land and resources be able to be marshaled for the sake of housing. So how did that actually unfold? What were there critical churches at the beginning that became sort of the test cases for you, or how did you see it go?
Yeah, so I've sort of been working at a few different levels. One is the kind of level of resources and helping churches think differently. So I've been working with a nonprofit called Rooted Good, and we provide an accelerator course we call the Good Futures Accelerator. And that allows churches to go through a 9-month journey on their own, self-directed with all the resources they need and the materials that we provide for them to think about how to use their buildings and land for some sort of social enterprise, some sort of activity that contributes to their neighborhood and their community and generates revenue.
Yes.
And then we built other resources like how to develop well and how to sell well and how to partner well and how to rent well and a guide around taxation. And actually this fall, we're about to create one on how to end well for churches that might be closing or just churches thinking about closing programs, for example, right? So all these are guides that have come out of the requests of churches or judicatories or others that are saying, hey, we're dealing with all these issues. And then I've been operating on the project level as well. So in Madison in particular, doing development with particular churches that are trying to live into this. And I'll maybe give one example here, and then it might be useful for further conversation. So one we're working with, we just broke ground on 2 weeks ago. Well, we broke ground on the second half of it. So 2 churches of 2 different denominations merged a few years ago. They went through the Rooted Good Accelerator course, and they use that process to really think about how are they engaging with their neighborhood. They were both shrinking congregations, both had buildings with deferred maintenance, but they weren't ready to close all completely. So they decided to join together and merge. They sold one of the properties and moved into the other property. The first property they sold, our development company just opened as Madison's most environmentally sustainable multifamily building ever built. It's fully passive house certified. You can heat an entire apartment with a single light bulb, even in Wisconsin in the winter.
Amazing.
And the building was financed with 100% equity. So there's no debt at all. And some of the subcontractors that worked on it actually own parts of the building. So it's really amazing.
That was in part from the sale of their property.
That
plus
was.
further
So
investors.
that was the sale of their property. So the one property became that building. And then they moved into this other property together and came up with this vision of redeveloping the second property as well, which is what we just broke ground on a couple weeks ago. And in that instance, we are taking down an old building that's got millions of dollars of deferred maintenance and replacing it with a community center. And their vision is to flip the script upside down, and rather than be a church inviting a bunch of people into their building, they actually have decided to create a building that is the community's.
Wow.
And then the church is the anchor user of that building, but it's flipping it upside down, right? And so there are 30 plus organizations that are that community center, and that will grow over time. And the church is still going to worship on Sunday. It's still going to do
Right.
Bible study. It's still going to do its churchy things, right?
Right.
In that space, but alongside all these other community groups and neighborhood groups. And it is just activated that spot for good.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
Right. And then at the same time, we're also putting up 26 units of workforce housing, which is a massive need in Madison
Right.
for housing and sort of moderate level housing as well. And so they've turned what was almost the closure of two churches into two remarkable new developments. One that's incredibly environmentally sustainable and fully equity owned, and the other that is basically this enormously life-giving community center and housing project. And that to me is sort of, I love it, right?
Yes,
I love
right.
that. That to me is being the church of the future. Yeah.
So that psychological journey, two separate congregations, they have their own history, tradition, etc. What was necessary from your observation for those churches even to imagine becoming partners? That would be major enough for a lot of churches to
Right.
even begin to imagine, let alone all of this further entailment. Was it this external leadership that you and others were bringing, or was it the pastoral leadership, or was it lay people inside the congregation? Probably all of the above, but unpack that a bit.
Yeah. Well, as you insightfully noted, it's all of the above. I mean,
Yes.
you know this well, Mark, how to do this work, but it's all of the above. I mean, I think outside influence had some measure of spark
Right.
and imagination
Right.
creating, and then some resourcing.
Yes.
But really, it does come down to the leaders, both pastoral
Right.
leadership and lay leadership.
Right.
And there is some really remarkable and normal people doing those things. I want to say that because I feel like sometimes these stories get portrayed as if they're like some sort of super people or something
Yes,
like
yes,
that. But they're
right.
not. They're
The
normal
heroic
people.
leader, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, they're heroic in a sense that they are willing to take some risks and that they are really visionary and they're seeking God's movement in their life and in their community, but they're also normal. They're, right? There's nothing about them that necessarily couldn't be done elsewhere, right? And so I think that's important for us all to remember.
Yeah,
we can all do
extremely.
this sort of work. We can all do this work. So yeah, it was all of those things. And it did require some letting go, obviously, right? It requires letting go of a vision of what they thought they were and replacing that with a vision for where they are actually and where they're going. It requires letting go of, I think, some measure of a sense of, well, that old model just didn't work, which sometimes carries with it a bit of shame, sometimes carries with it a bit of sense of failure, but I don't really know why. I mean, I do know why, but really that's, I don't think what God is calling us to. I think God is calling us to live into the next good step. And so it requires some of that, and it requires some risk taking, and it does require some, willingness to say, we don't know exactly how this is going to unfold. And they didn't know where they are 5 years ago, they didn't know they were going to be exactly here.
Right.
But they did have a sense that they had to be somewhere really quite different.
Yes, right.
Yeah.
Which is a breakthrough for them,
Yes.
for a congregation to really be able to grasp that.
Yes.
Did you find that, for example, the pastoral leadership went through something like maybe your experience of being converted out of necessity to tackle the thing that you've been given responsibility for, and then gradually came, I'm sure, external wisdom and insight, like going through your accelerator program, would have really helped build an understanding of a set of tools and frameworks that would potentially stir imagination and hope as opposed to just loss, which is often what churches feel when their story is being so seriously rewritten.
Yes, that's right. That is certainly what happened. It does often sort of present first as oh gosh, we need to figure out what we're going to do here. We have these buildings we can't pay for, and what, right? But then it does move into an imagination for something beautiful and wonderful and better in a way even than they could have imagined. But it doesn't always start there. Although I will say that this question of using what God has given us, which sometimes we frame in stewardship language, but is a question that I think all churches should be asking, even if they're a church of many thousands and with many millions in the bank and in their budget, right? Because to me, it's a question not just of how do we solve a problem, but it's a question of how do we make greatest use of what's available to us to serve our neighbor. And that's a question that every church can ask.
Right. Well, quite. Absolutely. So I'm curious if you can tell us a bit more detail about how not only the congregation needed to go through their own storytelling changes, but also these churches would have had histories or not with the surrounding neighborhoods that they were in. They would have had their own positive or negative or mixed reviews from neighbors. Now they're seeing these two churches do this very unlikely thing that they may not be, I realize, raptly attending to. But nevertheless, it starts making its impact as this becomes really clear what this whole story really is amounting to. How has the wider township or town interacted with these projects?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of ways to go at that. We just did this groundbreaking a couple of weeks ago, and we actually ended up calling it a ground planting or ground seeding rather than breaking. And our team, our construction team at Threshold here, that's developing the project, had this incredible idea to not just do gold shovels in a pile of dirt with a couple dignitaries, which we did do the dignitaries, but we painted the shovels rainbow colors instead of gold. And we got pots for plants and compost instead of dirt. And the entire community that gathered, which was over 100 people from the neighborhood that came, many of them walking there, which was really neat. Kids, older folks, everyone in between. And everyone got a chance to put some dirt and compost into these pots. And then when that had all been done and everyone had participated, the children all planted flowers in little plants in the pots, which have been taken to the owner of our construction team's house, where they're being tended to over the winter, and they'll be planted on site in the spring.
Wow.
And I tell that because that's an example of like what's trying to happen on the site on a deeper level, not just, you're right, and that was symbolic of something deeper. And so in this case, there was quite a bit of support. Now, there are always some detractors that don't want to see change.
Right.
That's not something that's limited to the church. Indeed. That happens in neighborhoods as well. But overall, has been received quite well, and people are excited about a church entity that's really trying to take seriously their call to be engaged in their community. A big part of the Good Futures Accelerator course is asking people to really ask that question about their community. And so there's multiple exercises in that process that involve walking the neighborhood. We have a little game called I Spy, based on the kids' game of I Spy with My Little Eye. But it involves walking the neighborhood and really trying to listen for what's going on in the neighborhood and in the community. We're great in the church sometimes of imagining what people want and need, but never actually asking anyone or listening for that.
Yes,
and so this work, especially place-based and kind of property-based work, really does depend on understanding the context and what's happening in the neighborhood.
I've had the privilege of working with the Lilly Endowment on an initiative they have that's called the National Storytelling Initiative. And it was born really out of Lilly's observation that so much of what's written and told about the life of the church is negative, about its decline, about its division, and so forth. But they happen to have a view and a set of insights into what's going on in Christian institutions and organizations that tell very life-giving, hopeful stories, not in some kind of hyper-glossy way, but just in the authenticity of authentic Christians credibly living their life and doing their common work and having it matter. So they're anxious for those stories to be told. I say all that as a background to say I'm sort of immersed in this world now of talking about stories. And one of the things that I really didn't think about in advance of our conversation, but it's unfolded and through the last few minutes, which is this sense that really at the very core, what you're doing is retelling a story in a completely different way, and in a way that is much more about this moment, grounded and motivated by an understanding of the character and love of God and God's compassion and mercy toward the community that churches are planted in, the mission of the church that's about permeating the presence and authenticity and credibility of the Christian faith. But actually, the really hard thing is that stories are super hard to change. And part of what we could say is one way of describing the division of the American church right now is around people holding on to narratives that are actually so primal in their understanding of things that to give up that narrative line that someone might be committed to really is a virtual impossibility, because it feels like that is the story, that's the framework. And certainly in, as you know better than I do, declining congregations that are faced with property and money challenges are holding on to stories. And so much of what immobilizes them or potentially mobilizes them turns on their capacity for storytelling. Could we take hold of our history and live it in a new way, which might look unrecognizable to our originating story, but which is nevertheless the right and faithful story for the future? I'm just curious if you want to comment on that. I'm just really struck by how, in a way, your enterprise is about storytelling and changing storylines.
Yeah, I think that's very insightful. We were doing some work really good with the Presbytery of the Inland Northwest in the Northwest part of the country. And at one of these things that we were doing with churches up there, the comment was made something along the lines of, we often have the faith of our sort of forebearers in the church, but the question is, do we have the courage of them?
Yes.
And in some ways, what we're talking about doing here is new and really different. And in many other ways, it's really not, actually. We've done new and different and challenging things before, both in the way church looks and in the use of land and in the use of money. Right. I mean, there was a time when somebody thought, hey, we need a pension fund for the denominations. There was a time when we thought, hey, let's start some hospitals and some schools, some really big things.
Right.
A lot bigger even than what I'm talking about. We've done.
Yes.
We often ask churches that are trying to enter into this space to actually reflect on their experience during the pandemic.
Yes.
Because there's not really a church in America that didn't do something new during the pandemic.
Right.
They all did.
Right.
They have that ability. They just often we haven't exercised that muscle very much. Maybe a little bit.
And volunteered for that training.
Yeah. And so, yes. And so what you're saying is telling stories about that, reminding ourselves of the stories, that we've been a part of that story. I mean, that story that goes all the way back to Jesus and the early folks that became what was the church, right? It's not new in that sense, but we do have to keep grounding ourselves and reminding and retelling those stories.
Right.
Yeah.
Because somewhere along the way, many ways over the course of millennia, the church has often sought stability and then permanence rather than remaining flexible and responsive and nimble in the face of whatever it is that might be going on. I mean, one of the things that is interesting as an example is that you and I met in Berkeley, California, at the First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley, where I was a pastor, you were a student, and where in the 60s, that church was faced with a crisis of a dramatic kind. There was a riot in Berkeley every 13 days for 4 years. There was a month when you could only get to church through the arms of the National Guard. The sanctuary gets condemned because the fire marshal believes that the bell tower in a classic stone sanctuary was simply too threatening to the viability of the church. The church had to decide, are we going to stay on that property, or are we going to move? Are we going to lose our location and have better parking, or are we going to actually stay in the bad parking zone? Eventually, that got addressed as much as it could. But the point was that in the boldness of that first move of the sanctuary to build a clear glass-walled sanctuary, changed the narrative in the 60s and 70s when it was actually being built, away from a stone church with stained glass into a transparent church that was trying at least to say, we're the church in the world, in the church. We're not trying to be invisible to you, and we're not wanting you to be invisible to us. And all are able to see and understand and engage with what's happening in the space. It completely changed First Press's life, and it gave a completely new narrative, even though it was built on the same kind of visionary intentionality of being founded a year before the University of California, Berkeley was founded, because of feeling like there needs to be a congregation on the corner of this campus. Mm-hmm. And that was a very bold move at the time that it happened. The campus hadn't even been started. And then in the 70s, it becomes necessary to completely reinvent themselves. And it's a very powerful thing that you're doing. And the reason that I've been so inspired by it is that it takes, as you illustrated, the really challenging, genuine decline problem, money problem, asset, it seems, deficiency, and then looks at it again and sees it more clearly with a clearer set of eyes that can evaluate optionality and possibilities that aren't typically on church horizons, and invents new stories in ways that not only can serve the life of the community, serve the life of the church, do both at the same time, and become a much more sustainable model for the future. To me, it's a very inspiring thing. So I'm just curious if you have any further response you want to make to that.
One of the things I've learned from my colleagues at Rooted Good that I've really enjoyed from their work and their inspiration is the value of constraints.
Yes.
So at Rooted Good, we really believe in constraints. And that sometimes comes down to very practical things, like if you use our tools and our games and our processes, you'll have time constraints.
Yes.
Like, in other words, talk about this for 5 minutes,
yes.
not for 5
years.
Weeks, years, 5 minutes, right? Because constraints can produce creativity and can produce, in a life of faith, can also produce a willingness to trust.
Yes, right.
Dependency. A willingness to follow, and a bit of a dependency in a good way, right, on something beyond ourselves. So to me, there's a great deal of struggle in this moment. And I don't ever sort of pretend that it's easy. And there's grief, there's real grief,
Absolutely.
There's real sadness, there's real difficulty as we close, or as we shrink, or as we change, or as we sell, or whatever. All those things are hard. And I think, in the way we grieve for when someone dies, we don't rush past that. Mm-hmm. We don't want to pretend it's not real. It's real. And we are a faith that's predicated upon the idea of death and resurrection, as well as on something new can emerge.
Right.
And there's a way in which I'm hopeful that the constraints of this moment actually lead us to greater creativity and greater trust. Mm-hmm. It was easy when we had plenty of money and plenty of people and plenty of structures to just build institutions.
Right.
That's not where we are anymore. So we're stuck with this thing that we have, right? And sometimes I say to leaders in the church, it's like that Frodo and Gandalf moment in Lord of the Rings, where Frodo says, I wish I didn't have to carry this weight, right? And Gandalf says, so do all, basically, who faced these times or these sorts of moments. But that's really not up for us to decide. What is up for us to decide is what to do with it and how to move forward from here. And that's where we're at, right? And so I'm hopeful, actually, in this kind of maybe ironic, maybe not, maybe just sort of turned around way, actually, that this constraining, challenging time will lead to really beautiful new fruit and new life, and maybe even let us let go of some of the ways we were in the church that weren't perhaps as life-giving as they could be. And so, I actually do find it a bit freeing.
Right.
This moment.
Fighting our finitude as human beings has been part of human nature from the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think the boundaries that you're describing, the limitations, is all part of that. And I think it's a beautiful thing. When you describe this process, the accelerator curriculum, you can accelerate the process that could bring about decision-making and clarification around purposes and plans, but you can't, in that sense, accelerate grief. So Talk to us about that part of the story. As you run into that element, which is always going to be present in all of these instances of these various places where this is happening, what are you seeing and learning about grief?
Yeah. Well, first I'll say we've had a lot of people tell us the name is wrong because in fact, what it usually does is not accelerate, but slow people down.
I see, yes.
So one of the things that often happens is folks want to dive right into real estate questions, like hiring a broker and hiring, figuring out this or that. And this process, we encourage us to step way back from that and to really think about purpose and mission first. And so people joke it should be called the Good Future Slow Down and figure out what we're about and where we're going thing, but that just doesn't ring very well. So we've stuck with it. Anyways, that said, yes, the grief question is real, and the question of how do you move when some folks really are struggling to move.
Right.
And I think we'll just be real about that, right? I mean, I'll tell another story since stories are helpful here. We were doing some work in San Antonio, Texas a few years ago and came across this church that had a remarkable story about this. They were facing a lot of the same issues that a lot of churches are facing that we've been talking about here today. And they were looking at turning their campus to really transforming their campus into a space that young adults could use to live, to come. So AmeriCorps folks, I think it was, and people like that, young adults and college students would live in these dorm-like sort of spaces and then volunteer all around the city and contribute to the work of the church in the city. But they were running up against folks saying, we just aren't ready to do that. We can't do that. And they just couldn't get past this intractable moment until finally somehow it came out that some of the members of the church wanted to have their funeral in the sanctuary the way it was. And that moment of just honesty and of vulnerability was the turning point. And they said, okay, that's good to know. That's helpful to know. And we are going to commit that will be the case. So the folks that are here, that are long-term members, that are founding members, that are, that want to have to know their funeral will happen in that space, we're going to commit to you that will happen. And we're still moving forward with the rest of the campus and its redevelopment. And we're not going to let that reality, as real and as important as that is, hold up the movement of the Spirit into the future as well. And so they actually were able to completely set aside this us or them or this or that or A or B and turn it into something a totally different both and. It was a both and. Yes, grief. Yes, this way of thinking. And yes, future. Yes, move forward. Yes, do this as well. And I always come back to that idea in my head, thinking about, gosh, where can we do that more often?
It's a very, very
yes, and instead of no, but.
Right. I know a pastor who inherited a kind of underground building plan that was being put together by people in the life of the church. And he began with the discovery that this was already fully in motion, but most of the congregation didn't know it. They eventually bring the plans to the congregation, and the chair of the campaign that was going to build this building was the widow of the former pastor. And one of their very closest friends came up at the business meeting and said, if your husband was still alive, he would do everything possible to keep this from moving forward. Well, that was all that really needed to be said to completely shut down the project. Now, what was interesting, and this is building off of what you're saying, they were able to use that roadblock, which really was just almost like sabotage in a certain way. There was just no way around that. And what happened was that they actually started entirely over with the process of defining their needs, conceptualizing the plan, involving the congregation, casting a vision for what the future of their property really needed to look like. And it all came around, and it's now been completed, and it was a thriving thing, which really was in this same space of yes, and that ended up feeling like there was a guardianship over the things that really could be preserved and kept, but there was also freedom to move forward in so many other ways that would never otherwise have happened. I do think that's where the courage comes in, right? It would have been easy for that pastor to have decided, okay, that's just like a hot potato. I'm not going there again. But instead, what unfolded was a very different story. And I've often thought that was a courageous act of leadership when you could, as a new pastor, think, I think I can only lose if we keep going down this road, which is another kind of grief. If you were to describe how this effort intersects with the general housing needs in America and the presence on a more national level, not just on a local level, but the need for affordable housing, how does what you're doing intersect with that national crisis?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple layers of national things happening, I think, that are worth potentially noting. Certainly the housing crisis that we're dealing with in much of America is real. I mean, it really is a serious one. And it flows out to all sorts of other things. I mean, also all sorts of other things that churches care about. So educational outcomes and food insecurity and family dynamics and all kinds of things that churches care about. Often they tie back to a lack of stable, affordable housing. I mean, a child living in a car is not going to, the implications of that for some period of years when they're growing up is going to change everything about their life. Not that it's, irredeemable or any of that, but it really is, it's tough and they're not going to do well in school. There's a lot of stuff's going to happen there. So addressing that very real issue, which is an issue of space and it's an issue of real estate to some extent on a very practical level. And churches have it. Right. Churches have real estate. So you've got this thing that we realize has a real potential to impact the things we care about and the people we care about, this difficulty around housing. And we've got this asset over here, which is land. And there's an opportunity to do something about that. I was a part of something also in San Antonio where a city leader actually said they think they could solve the entire affordable housing crisis in San Antonio simply off church land. Now, I don't think it's church's responsibility alone to do that. I mean,
right.
Government needs to be involved and other players need to be involved. But that's an interesting statement.
Right.
If we could solve the whole thing just with church land. The Turner Center in Berkeley actually did a phenomenal study. If folks haven't come across it, I highly recommend Googling it. They did an amazing study showing the amount of land available in California owned by churches, houses of worship, and colleges,
right,
available for affordable housing. And I believe they found about 5 times the city of Oakland, the size of the city of Oakland, is available across California.
Wow.
And they specifically screened this land for appropriateness for affordable housing. So not just all church land or all college land, but land specifically good for affordable housing on bus lines, on other, in other ways. That's a lot. 5 Oakland's worth of land is available,
that's
right,
enormous.
to put to work for affordable housing. And so that, that's not the answer everywhere. I often get calls from people, they read an article about a church doing affordable housing and they think, that's it, and I'm a big skeptic of models.
Right.
I love stories, I love examples. I'm not a big fan of models because I think models just sort of get us off the hook.
Yes.
Like we just take a model off the shelf and apply it. And that doesn't work in churches. It doesn't work in faith. And it doesn't work in real estate either because real estate's very location specific. But that said, there is a potential for a lot of churches to look at affordable housing. In my most recent book, Gone for Good, the opening chapter, a Presbyterian minister and sociologist predicts 100,000 church properties will be sold or repurposed in the next 10 years.
Wow.
And that's about 1/3 to 1/4 of all of them in the United States. It's a lot. Now, even if it's half that, it's still an enormous amount, right? And I'm increasingly hopeful that it won't just be sold, but it will be repurposed.
Yes, right.
Selling is one thing, and some of that's going to happen. But I would love to see us do less selling and more repurposing.
Right.
For those of us that have the stewardship of that land.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. It's an amazing thing. Well, I do want to say again, Mark, how grateful I am for the work you're doing. And we will feature in the notes the various links to your work as well as to books that you've written. And I just want to invite the listeners to take seriously this kind of work and vision and to ask yourselves, if you are involved in a faith community, in a Christian church or organization in some context, where your land and how your land is being used and how these fresh questions of a new story, a new storyline for the property, a new storyline potentially for the organization or congregation, and for the life that it can bring. I do, as some of my regular listeners will know, I have a great burden for the sense of what the church is doing to make clear that it has a credible witness in the world. And this kind of intersection and the working out of these things in their particularity, exactly as you're saying, not as a model, but in the particularity of a given community, people, location, is exactly where that credibility has to be recovered or strengthened. So thank you for what you're doing on a large scale and in particular. And just know that you're an inspiration to me, and I'm really grateful. So thanks for being on Conversing.
Thanks for great questions and a good conversation and years worth of support and inspiration myself. Really appreciate it.
Conversing is produced and distributed in partnership with Comment Magazine and Fuller Seminary. Peter Labberton is our engineer and editor. Evan Rosa is our producer. For more information about Comment Magazine, visit comment.org, where you can subscribe, read the current magazine issue, and browse their archive. Fuller Seminary is an evangelical, multi-denominational graduate institution committed to providing indispensable formational education for diverse Christian leaders everywhere. For information, visit fuller.edu. I'm your host, Mark Labberton. Thanks for listening with me.